Here's the thing about human speech. It's actually quite limited. In fact, I'd like you to listen to the different ways that I say I love you. 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 All of those carried a different weight and a different connotation, much of which almost entirely is stripped out in written form. And yet, in binary societies especially, we actually rely on written communication, devoid of extra context. And what's fascinating is that as people, quote unquote, awaken, that's just one way to put it, they start to be able to process more contextual information. They become more sensitive, if you will, to the nuance. And this is why I like to incorporate voice notes in my coaching, because you can pick up on a lot. And when you allow for it to be asynchronous, as I have adopted, it not only allows a listener to go back and listen multiple times, but it allows the brain to pick up on the context that it might have missed the first or second time. Why is this important? Because in my view of transhumanism, we would have a different communication type. One that is multi-layered with sensory information. This is a feature that would allow for more efficient communications. And I actually envision a file type that is embedded with different layers of contextual information, depending on what plugins and that the people have, and if there's any cross-species communications. I'll explain in a minute. But let's go back to the example. When we write, I love you, unless we load it up with emoticons, which are culturally significant and change depending on where you're at in space and time, what happens is that the bare minimum is communicated, but there's a lot of misinterpretation. And when the world runs on textual information, which is stripped down to its bare bones, why would we then be surprised that there's a lot of misinterpretation? There's a lot of projection and also a lot of coldness. But worse is that I actually find the written word, which I used to love and adore. At one point, I wanted to be a writer. Never thought of myself as a speaker until I started really opening up my flow. And I feel that when people are very reserved, like I used to be, they prefer writing because it allows them to perfect their message, and they don't necessarily feel that they can communicate what they intend on communicating if they were just flowing. It takes a certain skill and years of practice. At least in my case. Maybe not for everybody, but I was very reserved. So, as a result, those that favor writing may not actually like this idea. But here's why I believe that it is to everybody's benefit, because textual information is actually very inefficient. So not only is it stripped of context unless you pretty it up with language and the right adjectives and tone, which writers spend years mastering their craft to be able to do and become experts at. It's still communicating in a linear fashion. Da 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 ching, da 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 ching, da 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 ching. And at some point, I don't know if you do this, but at some point you're going to want, it's not even about conciseness. It's almost about the ability to take in the information faster than one-time speed. So at some point in the last year or two, I started listening to everything on 2 times speed. And it's wild. It's really wild. At first, it takes your brain a little bit of getting used to, obviously. And if it's very dense academic material, then I don't recommend it, especially if you're going to be tested afterwards. But for general language and podcasting and people sharing opinions and high-level things, I can't go back. In fact, when I try to go back, even if they're the smartest, most intelligent people in the world, and I'm talking like world-renowned physicists, going back to 1 time speed makes everybody sound like they are mentally delayed. And that has been my experience interdimensionally traveling, is that when you start processing information at a much higher rate, being in a world that is at relative 1 time speed or 0.5 is its own certain form of hell. And you almost need to slow yourself down in order to match the cadence, because you feel really out of place. And what I have observed is that the transmission of language, even the way I'm transmitting it now, is not only faulty, but it is cumbersome, because what we are doing is communicating symbols. These symbols are mapped to an internal database, if you will, that we have built based on our exposure in space and time. So our training, our vocabulary, our education, our parents, our family, our first and second or third languages, depending on how many you've got under your belt. And I admire you. That's not one of my strengths. What you find is that there's a joy in meandering. I love making these podcasts. I love taking listeners on a journey, and especially with upgraded mics. Thank you guys for hanging in, those of you who have been with me for a while I was going through some difficulties with my technical equipment. I actually tried out a couple of different things and they were all subpar. So I finally took the plunge and did a real upgrade, not just a lateral one. There's a joy in meandering and going on a ride and letting the brain sort of connect the dots. And there's a certain pleasure in it. And it's almost like an art in of itself. But it's kind of a niche art in a world that values clear, concise communication. And what we are doing collectively as a society is we're moving more and more to sound bites and headlines and jumping around on our attention. And some old timers might dig in their heels about that fact, but I actually believe that this is to our evolution, in that it behooves us to be able to process things quicker and to not have to store as much information in our internal databases that we used to. We're offloading everything to cloud, to AI, to search engines. We are not the holders of the knowledge anymore. We are almost the curators. And the way that our attention spans are being structured is that it's almost like we are creating these waves of information that we select from, and that we say, yes, I want to learn more about this, or no, I don't want to learn more about that. And we stand in these different streams with these little cups, and we drink from the streams, and we go on deep dives whenever we are called, but we don't want to have to deep dive every time that we are consuming content. And so this is the trend that I see, that we're actually shifting the way we process information. And so to sit down and read a 20-page academic essay or scientific paper, I think that there are scientists that are still going to be doing that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But we're not expecting the average layperson to want to do. And so then they want to hear a secondary source. They want a blogger to cover it, to give them some idea. It used to be that there were science writers. They would sit down and review scientific papers and disseminate that information to a lay audience. And instead of a 20-page paper that was now just like an essay that took 15 minutes of reading. Well, now people don't even want that. What they want is, what are the top 3 things that I need to know? Because I need to know whether or not to care about this. And I'm going to file it away as something that I could care about or should not care about. But I can at least talk about it because I understand the little nuggets of information. And if I do want to deep dive into it, then all I have to do is to go and explore on my own. So it's like we are curating more than we are holding. And so as a result, textual information, I believe, also needs to change, because it's no longer efficient to read a very, very long, and I love long emails. And emails are antiquated even of themselves. Websites, too, I believe, are also out the door at some point. People don't want to read blocks of text anymore. That's the point. And people don't want to have very long conversations if they're trying to get to a point, if they're trying to understand, what do I need to know? So, as a result, I actually believe that there is a way that we can do it differently. At some point in our transhumanism journey, for those that decide to go along, we will be able to communicate without words. We already do. And this is more in the minority, which is really bothersome to me, actually. We communicate with energy, we communicate with presence, we communicate with form and posture. And you can actually have an entire conversation without speaking at all. The benefit to this is that those symbols that are encoded in our databases are mapped with meanings and sensation and nuance that are very, very specific to you. And when we have a high degree of compatibility between people, it's usually because the internal databases that we share have a high degree of overlap, so we can understand somebody and we can really see their perspective. Where we struggle is when there's a high degree of disparity between the individual's internal data sets, such that when they're speaking, the words that they're using are decoded differently to a degree that creates more misunderstanding than it does collaboration. Language is the great unifier and the great divider. Because when it works well, It brings people together. It communicates my internal world, my vision to you. And when you can receive that the way it is intended with a high degree of fidelity, then what happens is people are activated. People are galvanized. And when there's the disconnect, that makes it extremely difficult to be productive, to do anything really, because then you have to fight over the semantics or you have to explain yourself a lot and et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. When we are communicating without words and we're just communicating with presence, it's such a beautiful experience. But I find that many people are extremely uncomfortable with it. So much so that they will fill the space with chatter, with meaningless chatter. Literally, things that we don't even remember talking about, sometimes within minutes of walking away. But we do this as a way to touch base with somebody, to acknowledge that they're there, because we're not used to communicating beyond the verbal. And so as a result, it creates what I believe is this confinement and a social structure that I find to be quite oppressive sometimes. Although now that I'm more grounded from my spiritual awakening, it's easier. Now it's not a problem for me to engage like that, but it's really actually a struggle, because there's another way of connecting. There's another way of feeling and another way of communicating. So at some point, when people are awakened enough, that's the only word that I have to use it, because that's the word that I've been exposed to explain why some people have this ability and some people do not. People who are not yet awakened spiritually, consciously, don't tend to have any extrasensory sensations or abilities. And they tend to be very three-dimensional, meaning they believe in the five senses that governs their precept of reality, that governs how they view and operate in the world. And they may or may not sometimes throw intuition in there, but even that is sometimes not even believed in, which is how I used to see the world. So there's no judgment. But as a result, communicating at these energetic levels or these more subtle frequencies is often lost on them. So they need verbal communication. Otherwise, they don't understand social structures. And they're not as in tune with the nuances of politics or the social arrangements. And I don't mean the political system politics. I mean the social behind the scenes, the power games, the shadow games, who's attracted to who, and the subconscious emanations from the unconscious shadow, all of these interplays that you begin to see after a certain point of awakening, that you begin to feel. And you begin to just intuitively know and grasp. So what we find is that there needs to be almost this multi-layered communication vector, that we still need some written language. But there needs to be another transmission beyond written language, and it needs to be a file type that we can send over the whatever the internet is at that time point. And this structure of communication needs to allow for selective expansion. So, for example, if somebody is predominantly oriented in a binary society that is not scheduled to transition to a quantum arrangement, for example, there are going to be some levels of information that should be excluded from them. And this could be easy because their technology is going to be rate limited. The infrastructure of their computers to decode the files will not be able to process quantum information. There might be some overlap, but you understand what I mean. There could be natural bridges to ensure that people are not exposed to more information than they could possibly handle, because it takes some time to integrate and to be comfortable with the extra levels of information, particularly if we're talking about the integration of sensory information. So, for example, if I am awakened in my heart chakra and I say, I love you, and I do so with a ring in my heart chakra, then somebody in a binary world would not receive that ring. But somebody perhaps who was, quote, awakened, or who was operating with that degree of sensory processing already online and already adapted, then they would have the file type with that extra layer in it. And they would receive the heart chakra signal that I was sending. This would also decrease deception, because people can be very excellent at vocal intonation or acting or misrepresenting their intentions. But at a certain point of this, quote, awakening journey, for lack of a better word, you can actually feel people's intentions. It's beautiful. It's so wonderful when that happens and when you feel that disconnect, because it reveals so much about that person. And so when you are communicating with them and you feel that disconnect, then you can understand that perhaps you're walking into something that might be a different arrangement than what you were thinking. This level of information processing would be available to you with some of these transhumanism integrations, is how I am viewing this. And again, because this is a heated, controversial topic, I'm not talking about the scary Orwellian transhumanism. I am talking about the ethical application of transhumanism. And my intent is actually to have positive conversations around this so we can collectively create a world that we are not frightened by, that we are empowered and sovereign in a new framework, in an upgraded, evolved version of humanity, which I believe is on the table. But we need people to collectively create it, and we can't do that without these conversations. So with these, I don't even know if they would be implants necessarily. There's a gap in my ability to understand how the technology would practically work and look like, because I don't have privy to how it's all going to unfold. But the way that I see it is that there would be an ability, almost like a turning on of a sensory mechanism, and whatever process in our quote unquote brain, if we're still confined to that principle. And I don't know, Dr. Hoffman's work makes me think that we might not be, but that's neither here nor there. Whatever mechanism that is computing this information for us, there would need to be an add-on, so to speak. And that would allow us to decode another level of information. Then, as we continue to evolve, we could have other information as well. So as we go into interspecies communications, we would have the ability to, kind of like the babblefish in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this little implant in our ear that we're allowed to then decode other species' language. it would be something like that, except it wouldn't be this little thing in our ear. It would actually be a sense organ that was able to receive, sort of like an antenna, the sensory information of another being. And let's say they don't have language or telepathy per se, but they have an energy system that's similar enough to our chakra system. And so we would receive that energetic frequency in addition to the support of some sort of transducing mechanism that would allow us to understand what their verbal intent would be. So it would almost be parsing both streams for us, because we, at some point, will break away from being predominantly vocal creatures, I believe. But I don't think that that's going to happen in this lifetime. But for a while, we're still going to need the language input, because that's how our cognition is structured. And so we're going to have some parsing of symbolism of language that's going to have to overlap between the species. But we could also feel their intent of energy, or the frequency that they're vibrating at, which would then get parsed as well. So we would start to branch out into other communication forms. And I believe that this needs to be a file type, because we need to be able to send it to different matrices and different societies in a variety of different societal arrangements. And some of them are going to be using devices like handheld personal communication devices or analog computers, where they're going to be receiving communications from outside of their body. And then others, when they bridge into transhumanism, are actually going to be receiving that communication through their physical form without the use of a handheld device. And they're going to be able to streamline the communications a lot more effectively. I also have another idea for a different communication vector and file type, but I don't want to get into that in this episode. I can continue those thoughts later. But the idea is centered around taking away some of those misinterpretations, adding in those layers of complexity and nuance which are already exist between us, but actually formalizing it into a file type that could be shared across different timelines, across different space points, across different infrastructures and societal arrangements, and allow for the vectorization, is what I want to say, but I'm not quite sure if that's the right word, of communications with transhumanism in a much more robust and fast application.